In many regards, the world has never been freer, safer, or more prosperous. Yet this new world order is also characterized by unprecedented instability and uncertainty. And most significantly, at a time when many are increasingly questioning the very future of the current international order, the world appears leaderless. This is a time when real leadership and visionary ideas are urgently needed.
Well, thank you, and welcome back, everybody, from the very, very brief break. I think Professor Kreisner really set the stage wonderfully for this opening plenary session. Some of the questions, we'll try to deal with the really big questions in this particular opening session, such as, well, the questions that I were given. How durable is the current liberal democratic international order? Is that big enough of a question for you? Are we entering a unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, or non-polar world? Looking forward to 10 years, what do you think are the greatest threats to the future of international peace and security? These are some of the very broad issues that we'll try to deal with. And to help us deal with these very important questions, we have four distinguished panelists. Allow me to briefly introduce them, starting with Professor Qingguo, professor of and associate dean of the School of International Studies at Peking University. He has taught at many universities in the United States, including Vermont, Cornell, UC San Diego, and others. He has published extensively on U.S.-China relations and the cross-straits relations as well. Next to him is Dr. Douglas Paal, who is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also served in the private sector, worked in the private sector as Vice Chairman of J.P. Morgan Chase International. And of course, he's one of the foremost intellectuals and practitioners in the United States of this part, on this part of the world. To his left is Dr. James Steinberg, who is the Dean of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University and the University Professor of Social Science, International Affairs, and Law. And of course, as all of you know, previous to his deanship, he served as the Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. His publications include Difficult Transitions, Foreign Policy Troubles at the Outset of Presidential Powers, which he co-authored with Kurt Campbell. To his left is Dr. Professor President Tanaka Akihiko. Dr. Tanaka is currently the president of the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And of course, as many of you also know, he was most recently the vice president of University of Tokyo and the director of the Division of International Affairs at the University of Tokyo. His publications include The New Middle Ages, The World System in the 21st Century. So once again, thank you all for joining us. And again, as we always try to do, we'll try to have as a lively interaction and conversation for us. But I would like to give each panelist just 5-6 minutes to make opening statements, and we'll start with Professor Chia.
Okay, thank you very much, President Hahm. It's a great honor and privilege to come here to talk and share some of my thoughts on this issue. It's the world in disorder. In a way, the world is always in disorder. Thus, when we use disorder to describe the world, it seems to me that one should put it into proper perspective. As far as the world we are living in is concerned, it seems to me that the following facts deserve our attention. The first is that the world is not in a large-scale war, or either hot or cold. The second is the rising power and the existing hegemon, the United States and China and the United States, have important and increasing shared stakes in the existing international order, and as a result, China has not challenged the existing international order, rather it has embraced it. The US has not launched a policy of containment. I don't consider pivot as a policy of containment. Both are talking about seeking common ground while preserving differences. So it is also a world that certain values, such as free market, rule of law, human rights, and democracy, are increasingly shared throughout the world, rather than the other way around. In a world, whereas there is disorder in the world, this is not a disorderly world. To say it is not a disorderly world, however, does not mean that the world is not facing challenges, and even serious challenges. It does, and the challenges are many. First, I think it's the power transition. China has been growing rapidly, and the gap between China and the rising power and the US, the hegemonic power, is narrowing. Realists have predicted trouble, confrontation, war between the two countries because of this. This challenge is further complicated by dual identities and interests on the part of China as the rising power. China has dual identities and interests in many aspects. It is a developing country, it's a developed country, it's a weak country, a strong country, it's a poor country, rich country, ordinary power and superpower. So its interests are often in two sets of interests, and often they are in contradiction. So it's very difficult for China to define its interests. It's very difficult for China to practice a coherent policy in foreign affairs. And this complicates outside world's interaction, perception and interaction with China. And all this happens, and of course, all this happens at a time when the world is facing many global challenges, ranging from proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to climate change. And it also happens at a time when we most need leadership. However, the world is facing a problem of leadership deficit. The US and Europe are focused on domestic issues or internal issues. Japan has a problem in terms of history, and China is also focusing its attention on domestic problems, and also, and at the same time, it has not acquired much interest in managing world problems. So we are facing a range of problems. How durable, under the circumstances, is the current US-led liberal democratic order, international order? I think the liberal democratic order is durable. Many countries have now turned to democracy since the end of the Cold War, and even China is trying to construct a socialist democratic politics, as it is termed. So Chinese government is saying democracy is a good thing, but then we should practice according to Chinese conditions. But whether it's the liberal international order is going to be US-led remains a question. It all depends on the will and the way the US exercises its leadership. Are we entering a unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, or nonpolar era? I think in the short run, it's going to be unipolar. Despite China's rapid rise and its economy may overtake the US in terms of size, the power gap between China and the United States remains huge. Recent developments also indicate that China's economic development may slow down. So it will take some time before one can talk about systemic change. That is from unipolarity to something else. Looking forward 10 years, what are the greatest threats to future of international peace and security? I think the greatest threat remains how China and the international society manage the rise of China. Both sides need to fully appreciate the challenges. Both sides need to take necessary steps to manage their relationship. At the conceptual level, I think the international society should learn to adapt to China's rise, and China should learn about the limits of its power. The international society also needs to be patient with China, and China is changing. It has been changing in a positive direction in general. So a little patience doesn't hurt. China, on its own part, should be cautious and pragmatic as to what it does. It is in the process of change, both in terms of identities and interests. So it has problems of defining its interests. It has to be very cautious in its actions, taking a strong position only when it is absolutely clear about its implications. Finally, both sides should engage in effective cooperation on selected specific issues and build trust through successful cooperation. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Doug, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for Asan's terrific organization, the staff's terrific support for all of us who've come to participate in the conference and for the work you've done, Chaibong. Conference topic of disorder reminds me that there are a few people in the room of a certain age who will remember 1968 in the United States, which is one where we thought we had reached, many of us thought we'd reached a point of permanent disorder. Riots in the streets in Chicago over the Democratic Convention, the shooting of Martin Luther King, Tet Offensive, death of Robert F. Kennedy. At that time, Richard Daley went before the cameras in a kind of excited moment as mayor of Chicago and said, "Gentlemen, the police are not here to create disorder. They're here to preserve disorder." And of course, we all have a professional interest in this ourselves. It keeps people talking to us. But I think I'd like to make 3 points today about the topic that you've posed for us. First, I think we have a remarkable opportunity in the fact that on his first visit as vice president to the United States, Xi Jinping, the then vice president, talked about building a new kind of great power relationship with the United States. He didn't go into details. He left the blanks unfilled below the headline topic. But it evoked a positive response from Hillary Clinton in her subsequent remarks in U.S. Institute of Peace in Annapolis, where she said the U.S. would like to see how we can establish a peaceful transition with a rising power and a resident power, dealing with each other in a nuclear age. And I think that was a very positive response. And recently on his first visit as Secretary of State, John Kerry said to the Chinese leadership that he would like to establish what he called a special relationship. Whether that term lasts or not, I think, is a big question. But I think that the intention has been expressed on both sides to try to establish a positive and cooperative agenda of relations because everybody feels the things we're talking about at this conference, the rising tensions. Positive cooperation comes from the lips in the form of rhetoric, but if you look at the record of the last couple of years, it's been very spotty and very much in the last year, a period of rising tensions between China and its neighbors. My second point is that there's a very positive past example to look at that isn't much discussed. Maybe the people in this room all know it, but during the tension-filled 2010, you had mentioned earlier the Yanpyeong-do shelling, the sinking of the Tian'an corvette, cost so many lives of South Korean sailors. We also had incidents in the South China Sea and the East China Sea around the Diaoyudo Senkaku Islands. And not very well understood is that in that period, the Obama administration dispatched Larry Summers as chairman of the National Economic Council and Tom Donilon, who was then Deputy National Security. Were you on that trip? No. That Deputy National Security Advisor to Beijing in September 2010 to say, let's stop and put this on a better course. And the present that was put on the table to be unwrapped by the Chinese was a real state visit to the United States by Hu Jintao, who had kind of a half-state visit under the Bush administration, and there were many unsatisfying elements about that. But the U.S. also said, but there are some issues that we need to clear away if we want to have a really good state visit. And they talked about bilateral trade and investment issues, reducing tensions in some of the coastal territorial spots, and some restraint on North Korean behavior, movement on the currency. These issues were put on the table, and for the next 2 months, a close observer could have watched the Chinese internal debate taking place over whether or not the package of a better relationship with the United States, highlighted by a state visit by Hu Jintao to the U.S., or continued tensions were the better choice. And the good news was that in December 2010, virtually on the same day that the White House received a positive response to the invitation for a state visit, Qingguo, who was then handling affairs at the top of the Chinese foreign policy apparatus, published an article on the Foreign Ministry website saying China needed to return to the path of peaceful development. And lo and behold, the many very outspoken Chinese commentators who were egging on conflict between the two sides suddenly went silent. We saw a really good period of involvement, including embedding in this new post-2010 relationship an exchange of visits which led up to the Xi Jinping visit to Washington and Joe Biden's visit to China in August 2011. 2011, yes. I take this second point as very, very important because it's instructive that positive engagement, agenda setting, can put us on a track that's more constructive. But it's not something you just do for a year or two. It's got to have a long-run program. So this brings me to my third point today, which is we're at a new phase. Your film at the outset of today's session talked about the leadership changes all over the region. It's time for a kind of a regional reset for all of us to establish a new agenda. Obviously, Xi Jinping has his domestic priorities. President Obama has his priorities. Others in the region have theirs. But along the way, we need to find mechanisms to try to fill out the substance that comes under the headline of a new kind of great power relationship. And I think that the opportunity presents itself, certainly one opportunity coming up is the strategic and economic dialogue between the U.S. and China in July. And I think we ought to take this dialogue and move it to a higher performing level of ambition. I can proffer 5 baskets of issues that would be appropriate. They're already there in the dialogue, but I think they need to be addressed more ambitiously. Let's take the economic side, for example. We're talking about RCEP and TPP in the Asia-Pacific region. China's in RCEP, not in TPP. Sometimes people think there's an effort by the U.S. to exclude China. I don't agree that that's the case, but that's one of those perceptions out there. I think we need to get past these narrow disputes over the contours of this or that negotiation and try to say, what are the elements that will be important to an enduring, mutually beneficial economic relationship for the U.S. and China, and as well for our neighbor relationships. And my ambition would be to set something like a 15-year goal of Chinese and U.S. joint participation in some new level of regional or global free trade agreement that we can get to by steps. Now, the agreement, that's vague and off there. But the steps that we need to get there include some very concrete matters. Bilateral investment treaty, government procurement agreement done through the WTO that affects materially the interests of both of our sides. The bilateral investment treaty needs to address the impediments on the Chinese side to investment in Chinese finance, transportation, energy sectors. And on our side, the CFIUS tendency to scare ourselves to think anything the Chinese do is some kind of national security threat to our economy. Then that's one of the baskets. The second basket I would propose would be something for these new transnational issues, cyberspace, outer space, some maritime issues. And then again, set high ambitions. They're going to engage the bureaucracies for a decade or more in trying to achieve substantial forms of new international rules of the road on how to deal with these. Some of these are not soluble. Intelligence theft and using the cyber weapons of mass destruction are probably never going to be negotiated away. But theft of intellectual property, theft of processing and the like is something that, anti-pornography on the internet, these are areas where we ought to be able to find a basis for cooperation. Third, and very important to this conference, I think, the basket would be regional issues. And I would have my own hierarchy. It would start with the Korean Peninsula, where we would try to find a mechanism for the United States, and it would probably have to be us taking the lead, but to try to evoke from the Chinese a strong response to what do we see as the long-term basis for stability on the Korean Peninsula that meets the interests of the Chinese and American governments. And is that basis one where we perpetuate the state that Stephen Krasner so effectively described in his presentation? Or do we find some alternative outcome, and how do we get there? What are the reassurances, whether we want to use that word, Jim, you tell me, the reassurances, and mutual understanding of what our bottom line is, what our red lines might be, and then try to find some modus vivendi to get there. Then we move down the coast. You've got the East China Sea. There are potential for agreements on rules of the road, codes of conduct, fishery agreements, mineral extraction agreements, probably done on a multilateral basis to allow the countries to get around this sensitive sovereignty issues. Go on all the way around India to Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, where the U.S. and China have got different perspectives on how to proceed, and where we could get into conflict if we don't sort of try to preempt the conflict by getting a better understanding of each other's positions and some understanding of what we should and should not do with respect to the other's interests. And you go on to create these other baskets. I think you can actually take the opportunity presented to us by Xi Jinping's statement on new kind of great power relations and Mrs. Clinton and subsequent officials' acknowledgement that this is an important goal, which is to have this power transition take place without fatal conflict, and give it some raw material to work with. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Doug. There's Steinberg. Jim, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be back with such a great group of people and a terrific panel to start this off. You know, one of the things I've learned over the years is that policy planners, president and former, are bad predictors. And if you'd asked me to predict, as I was thinking about what I'd say today on the way over, that I would be preceded by three people who gave such an optimistic account of where we stood today, I would have been totally off base. And I'm delighted to hear it, frankly. I mean, our professions, both as scholars and practitioners, tends to be on the doom and gloom side rather than the optimism. And I don't really want to be the Debbie Downer here, but I think I will try to maybe introduce at least some greater sense of anxiety. But I do want to say in the beginning that I appreciate Steve Krasner's introduction. I especially appreciate what Dr. Jia Qingguo had to say about the state of U.S.-China relations. And I have to say I earnestly hope that both sides are listening to his very sober and sound advice, because I think it is a strong basis for going forward. And I think if our leaders take that road, we will have reasons to be optimistic. I guess what I want to focus on, I'll talk later tonight about this region, so I'm not going to focus on what people have tended to focus on here, but some of the other issues that Steve talked about and why I'm a little bit more worried in two particular respects. One, on the global governance side, I think there are a set of issues, and Steve knows them well, has written about them, that do worry me in terms of the capacity of the international system to deal with them. And many of them are not the traditional national security issues, but nonetheless the ones that ought to have us worried. We've had a couple of people briefly touch on the issue of climate change, but if ever there were an issue, a problem from hell, this is one for the policy community, the fundamental incapacity of the structures we have both at the national and the international level to deal with this challenge, which frankly, I mean, it's partially a function of the fact that my wife is a climate scientist, but you look at this and you look at the trajectory that we're on and the potential consequences of what we're doing and the probability that we will develop effective strategies to deal with it, it's quite troubling. And it is a major source of disorder. I mean, this is not just an inconvenience, but actually could be fundamentally upsetting economic, social, political order in many, many places. You just look at what's happened from Hurricane Sandy in the United States and the disruption that caused, and the predictions over the next 50 years about what the consequences would be in sub-Saharan Africa, in other coastal state areas. And this is a phenomenon the likes of which, in terms of a game changer, I think we have not really put our heads around. And having been deeply involved back in the days, back from the Clinton administration, when we tried to begin this conversation at Kyoto and then following through all the COPs and the UNFCCC since then, the reality is we aren't even nibbling at the edges here. And while there's certainly efforts being made, and I applaud some of the things that China's doing in particular to try to deal with issues around energy intensity, the disconnect between the level of effort and the nature and the seriousness of the problem strikes me as a really, really serious problem. And we don't have any real mechanisms now internationally to deal with. The kind of universal framework of the UNFCCC will not produce a result, and we spend a lot of time in it. efforts, Steve talked about coalitions of the willing. The major economies effort was an attempt to find a structure to do that, but it hasn't, in fact, generated the kind of concerted international efforts. And, and absent a silver bullet of somebody figuring out some shield to put up in the sky, I think we are in for major, major trouble here. And, this is another one like Steve's final category. I don't have a good answer to, but I do worry a great deal about it. And I think related to his observations about biological warfare, you don't even have to have a malign actor. We look at what's happening with the latest strain of avian flu and the potential for pandemic disease and the nature of the way in which just the natural order is causing mutations, the way in which our use of antibiotics and others have made us less able to respond to these things. One should not forget what happened with the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, and something of that scale is absolutely, it's not a black swan. I think it's a high possibility. And again, we don't have the institutions or the mechanisms for the global surveillance, the global interventions to deal with these things. And these aren't even coming from malign actors or even necessarily from weak states. They can come from lots of places. And so there's a set of phenomenon there that I worry a lot about. And the second set of phenomenon that's related is it's not, and Steve touched on it, it's what Tom Friedman calls the super-empowered individual, but it's also the fact that so many of the big phenomena now are mass phenomena. And so much of what Steve correctly said is the sort of the focus of grand strategy is on what states do as opposed to what peoples do. There's been a lot of criticism of the current administration and others about not having a strategy towards the Arab Spring. I don't know how you have a grand strategy towards mass movements of that sort. I think that we're in a world in which the combination of technology and communications have created a whole new set of phenomena that are very, very difficult to wrap your hands on in terms of policy and getting around it. You can try to sort of position yourself to understand where these things are going, but the ability to influence these movements, which is what policy and strategy is about, I think is quite limited. I don't know how you take a phenomenon like the Arab Spring and say that U.S. policy or anybody else's policy, at least in the short to medium term, is going to affect the course of these events. I think they're by their nature difficult to predict, and they're subject to extraordinary levels of virulence in the way we think about viral websites and videos and the like that make it very hard to predict, and yet they can have tremendously destabilizing consequences. And so, when you think about how small phenomena like the fruit cellar in Tunisia can trigger, I mean, there are obviously ripe conditions for it, but it's still figuring out what's the thing that's going to do it, not to mention how you would get your hands around that in terms of policy. And those destabilizing forces are quite considerable. I mean, one is not surprised why, although I'm happy about it, that the leadership in China sees the Arab Spring and gets very nervous, because it's hard to know what would trigger the kind of phenomenon that seems low probability but high consequence. So I think that there are a set of phenomena in this world, and I think this transition, we've talked about it for a long time, but this deep transition to a post-Westphalian order where states are still important, and we're certainly seeing in this region a situation where they're important, but even here, and I'll conclude with this because I will say more about it tonight, even here some of the mass phenomena, the intersection of contemporary media, social media, and nationalist movements and the like are going to have pose an enormous challenge to the ability of governments to get a handle on these phenomena. And so while I absolutely agree with Qingguo's assessment about where the leadership of our two countries want to take the relationship, there are a lot of forces at play, and Steve touched on this as well, that I'm not sure we can master to the same degree. And so objectively, there are lots of reasons to have the kind of positive outlook that my colleagues have identified, and I want that to be the case. And certainly from a practitioner's point of view, you have to embrace the potential for the upside and being able to use policy to achieve it. What I worry about are these phenomena which are very insensitive to policy interventions and yet have very broad consequences for our long-term well-being.
Thank you, Jim. Now, Dr. Tanaka, Aki, please.
Thank you, Chaibong. It's a great honor to be invited to the Asan Plenum. As both a practitioner and academic, I'm not sure which way I should go, optimistic or pessimistic, but let me start with the optimistic side. As somebody who's in charge of international development cooperation, I I think my job cannot be conducted without being optimistic. Well, there are good news in the world. Asian economies are doing good. I believe now the Indian Ocean is emerging as another ocean of prosperity. Myanmar is in the midst of democratic transformation, very, very impressive. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is growing. Over the last 10 years, the entire sub-Saharan Africa has grown more than 5% on the average. And Latin America, nobody talked about Latin America without probably Chavez, post-Chavez relations with the United States. But Latin America is very, very peaceful now. And so there are positive elements. But then, of course, this is the subject is disorder. So I need to come back to the sources of disorder. I see 3 sources of disorder in the current world system. One, financial crisis in Europe. The second, interstate politics in Asia. And the third, fragility and domestic violence from what I call the dry area stretching from Afghanistan to the Sahel region in Africa. The financial crisis in Europe is largely caused, in my understanding, by the incongruence of the monetary union and the fiscal responsibility in European attempts of creating a 21st century style political economic entity, going beyond traditional sovereign states. Interstate politics continues to produce conflicts in Asia and the Middle East, North Korea, Iran, East and South China Seas. The traditional sovereign states, sometimes reinforced by nationalism, are engaged in the games of power politics. Intrastate conflicts characterize politics in countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Mali. Transnational extremists penetrate into these areas where no effective sovereign states govern their territory. In other words, the current disorder, in my understanding of the world, is derived from, first, movements beyond sovereignty. Second, interaction among traditional sovereigns. And 3, conditions lacking effective sovereignty. Well, theoretically, Europe may resolve the difficulties by making the Euroland more like complete sovereign state, making the United States of Europe. Fiscal policies of member states need to be unified, as long as the money is unified. However, could the German people be really willing to share the same fate with Greeks and Cypriots? What will be the relations between the Eurozone EU members and non-EU members, non-Euro EU members? Will the United Kingdom stay in the EU? I think, as in the past, improvisation and muddling through is what we may expect in Europe, and the EU will not break up, in my understanding, but many, many uncertainties. And the economy with the size of Europe can be, I think, really a significant source of concerns. Interstate tensions has become serious, especially in East Asia. So far, deterrence seems to have worked so far. No major wars occurred, as Qingguo mentioned. But North Korea's attitude, particularly toward the Kaesong Industrial Park, was really puzzling. Also, Sino-Japanese relations are tense. Well, probably slightly better now than half a year ago, but a slight improvement may not be reassuring. Modus operandi has not yet been worked out yet. Well, penetration of extremists in the fragile, what I call dry zone, is serious. Of course, there are positive trends in that respect too. Somalia has finally had a government. Sudan and South Sudan has reached an agreement about the arrangements of the oil flowing from South Sudan. The French troops pacified at least major cities in northern Mali. However, the situation in Syria is very, very serious. The Obama administration has to be cautious as to the evidence of the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. That's understandable. But if in fact the Assad regime used chemical weapons, it has to take actions different from previous patterns. However, the dilemma for the United States is that the influence of extremists is becoming stronger among the rebels fighting against the Assad. The rebels' victory may turn out to be a victory of jihadists. And then, in addition, the condition in Syria now is influencing other countries, particularly Iraq, where sectarian violence is increasing. Well, all in all, this new world disorder poses complex challenges. Management of movement beyond sovereignty, management of interstate sovereigns, and management of fragile states and areas where sovereignty does not take hold. Sovereignty, effective sovereignty, has not taken effect. No easy solutions there. We should separate issues carefully and cope with them one by one. As somebody who's in charge of International Development Organization, I believe in optimistic trends in resolving these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I'm really confused. So it turns out actually the most orderly part of the world is actually the emerging US-China relations. Is that what you're trying to tell? Okay, so if that's the best part of it, but if we could sort of focus the discussion a little bit on the region. Aki has already brought us to that a little bit, but when we look at this part of the world, I think one of the striking things, the sense in which we get this idea of disorder so much is that when the Cold War ended and we normalized relations with China, for instance, the incredible transformation that was brought to this part of the world was just enormous. And for about, 20 years, we were on this high, thinking that, hey, finally we've solved so many of the questions. Our security relations, security environment just completely transformed itself. And when we engaged North Korea, we thought it was a manageable problem. And then our economy grew. Everybody prospered. And so we were really thinking that is East Asia almost entering a postmodern era as well? Are we following the Europeans here? And the Japanese were the most postmodern. And something happens in a couple of years. And then we're all of a sudden transformed into this very, very pre-modern or quintessentially modern era in this part of the world. And then all the question, not only is the sense of what we had, the sense of achievement based upon what we thought was at least the regional order is being fundamentally overturned. And then if we start adding on to all the scary things that Jim reminded us of, this region then is actually home to every single one of the things that Steve mentioned, that you mentioned, including pandemic disease, including climate change, including cyber issues, you name it. This region then is all of a sudden home to all of this, and of course including the malign state that seems to have this disproportionate influence on the security environment in this region. So then, what I would like to, if we just focus on And we have been focusing on how to deal with the rise of China all this time. But it seems to me, again, I'm trying to push the point a little bit, if that's the least of our concerns, because at least given what you guys were just saying, you have put a lot of thought into this relationship. And both sides seem to be arriving at some kind of a consensus that, okay, there needs to be rational thinking and dealing with this issue. But then there are all these other issues that are encroaching and they're waiting to pop up. And so, for instance, with the North Korean issue, do we have the wherewithal, even the U.S.-China relations, does it have the wherewithal to deal with this particular issue? So, I'll ask anyone to start. Doug? Qingguo?
I'll be glad to start. My opening assumption is that the situation is actually deteriorating across the board, and that we need to inject some positive agenda items to try to arrest it. We have competition and cooperation. Competition is gaining rapidly on cooperation, and if you look at the inventory of disputes in this part of the world, there's one unit or maybe the Chinese would argue two factors that are common to all of them, which one of them is China in its disputes with each of these countries and its support for North Korea's behavior. And secondly, they would allege in China that the U.S. was behind a lot of the recalcitrance or reluctance or difficulty with Vietnam and Philippines and even Taiwan and Japan. And so I think that situation is actually on a deteriorating track, and the question is, can we find mechanisms, drawing on, as I did in the experience of 2010, where we did see some getting us back on track, try to find something that's more ambitious, more long-term, that will help discipline our systems to try to find the productive outlets for our energies that will offset the grinding mutual strategic suspicion and the investments that are taking place in competitive security capabilities.
And is that the G2? No. Jim?
No, I mean, I don't think it's a G2, but I think the difference is that, I mean, one can be optimistic or pessimistic, and I share Doug's concern that the situation is deteriorating. But the difference is that with these state-to-state problems, it's possible to imagine a set of solutions and a set of approaches that could mitigate the problem. It's not going to solve them. There will be a competitive element, and I think we have to understand that, I think, again, Steve helpfully pointed this, you can't freeze the international system. It's always changing. There are always underlying demographic, economic, social, so it has to be a constant period of adaptation. The concert of Europe only lasts for a period of time. The deals can't hold. So you're not going to get to stop doing these things. But this is statecraft in the ways that we kind of know it. And there are domestic political pressures that make it hard, and it will take leadership, and all those things are right. But one can specify, as Steve and others and Qingguo have done, things that you could do that would mitigate, ameliorate these problems. And so that's where I think the optimism comes. And you rightly raised the question, sort of, on the places where you can't figure out where the statecraft is going to work, and that includes both what I talk about, which is sort of the non-state phenomenon, but also in the case of the malign states that Steve talked about, where statecraft doesn't seem to be working. I mean, the problem with Iran and North Korea is that there are lots of models about how you deal with these situations, inducements, threats, grand bargains, step by step, but none of them seem to be, because we've tried them all, right? I mean, I think the frustration, both with respect to Iran and North Korea, is that there's a sense that we've got this grab bag of ways in which we deal with these policies, and one by one we pulled out all the tools, and none of them are working. Now, people, you hear in the debate here, you hear in the United States, well, you didn't try that one hard enough. But I don't think that's the problem. I don't think it's because we haven't been nice enough to the North, we haven't been tough enough on the North. I think it's just we haven't figured out, how you do this, and what it is that goes into the calculus, or whether there is a state-to-state solution here. I mean, part of the problem is that it may be, I know a lot of people say they're rational, but there's always a rationality of some kind. Rationality is situational. But I think that especially with North Korea, and to some extent with Iran, the existential framework within which the leadership thinks about these problems here just may be impervious to all these things, including the kind of extreme measures. You know, we talk about, could you get China to completely cut them off? I'm not so persuaded that even if we did, that would get them to, I mean, it would cause chaos in the north, but it wouldn't let them, it wouldn't necessarily lead them to say, oh, now we get it. Now we have to change our ways. It may be that the kind of the structures that they've created in terms of their own ideational myths and all that may make it not so susceptible to policy per se. And so, you know, I think that's where the difference in the optimism you're hearing is. It's not that we're confident, I'm certainly not confident we will successfully manage U.S.-China relations along the lines that others have talked about, but I can see a game plan along the way Doug talked about it and Qingguo that would work. If we could get people to do it, if we could manage the domestic politics, it would work. And so that leads you to be at least more positive about at least the chance of coming out, as opposed to these things which feel much more intractable.
I think if you talk in the short run, then you see a lot of problems. China, as I mentioned, is in the process of transition. During the process of transition, China has dual identities and interests in different areas. So China finds it very hard to define its policy. For example, climate change. On the one hand, China tries to cut emission, take drastic steps at home, acting like a developed country. And on the other hand, when China went to the Copenhagen summit, China make defense of the right to development as its priority as a developing country. So, this happens in many areas of China of issues. China finds it very difficult to define its interests at this stage. And of course, when China finds it very difficult to define its interests, the external world finds it very confusing. So the interaction gets very complicated and sometimes, very difficult, very problematic. But then, if you look at the trend of development, if you take a look at the historical trend of development, then you tend to become a little bit more optimistic. In the old days, we had so many things very diametrically opposite to each other. Nowadays, we share increasing things in common. Free trade. Now, China and the U.S., are free trade advocates. We have our problems, but then in principle, we are free trade advocates. And the international order, both are stakeholders. And also, when we talk about the newer issues like cyber security, I think there is an increasing awareness on the part of the Chinese that it is not only in the U.S. interest to have cyber security. It is probably more so in China's interest to have cyber security. What if the terrorists control our nuclear weapons? It's terrible. So on North Korea, increasingly, I think our positions are getting closer. So if you take a longer perspective, I think China is becoming more like the United States, as a sort of more developed, richer, and with more vested interests in the current international order, and also more like a superpower, thinking in terms of global responsibilities as well as global influence. Okay.
Aki, would you like to?
Yeah, I believe East Asia is in the 21st century too, not in the 19th century or 20th century. But I suggest that interstate politics is strenuous here. As Professor Stephen Krasner mentioned in the keynote speech, I think if China and the others follow traditional logical power politics, we may be able to achieve stability. So interstate politics in East Asia is not necessarily producing wars. But then I think there are some new elements in the 21st century. One, I think, is this influence of the domestic politics into interstate politics. Many citizens can influence the relations amongst the sovereign states by their private actions. And then as a country becomes more democratic and more open, it is very hard to prevent these private citizens to having influence on interstate relations. And therefore, probably we need a lot more capacity on the part of the governments to prevent accidents, prevent unnecessarily escalation, and that sort of things. And another thing I think is I probably would like to ask Professor Krasner on these questions. This the introduction of the concept of malign states. Do the malign states totally different kind of creature that would be immune to the logic of power politics? If deterrence doesn't work, then we have in a deep trouble. We don't know. I think there are many specialists on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, a malign state, a new category of international actor. If so, that's maybe very hard to deal with.
So, Steve, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, no, I mean, in some ways, this was a parochial American perspective. Malign, although it certainly would include the interests of South Korea, Japan, China, perhaps even China. I mean, malign in the sense that they're pursuing a set of policies which are antithetical to the policies that we would prefer. But I think this question of are they susceptible to, as Jim was saying, I mean, the instruments of statecraft that we have available to us, no, the reality is no, they're not very susceptible.
We just opened it up to the floor. So, let's take if you could identify yourself briefly and wait for the microphone just quickly.
Thank you. Greetings. I'm the Ambassador of India. My name is Vishnu Prakash. I have two very quick questions. One, Dr. Hahm, I am also as confused, not as, but I mean, I'm also not going back any wiser. I have panelists from 4 countries and just wanted to understand, can the panelists agree? I know it's difficult to agree, but can the panelists agree on 3 triggers of the new world disorder? Is it possible? That is one. 2, Dr. Chia mentioned about the US and Chinese views or outlook possibly converging vis-a-vis North Korea. Again, my question is, and from your vantage point in Beijing, what has brought about the convergence so quickly in the last few months? Is it that there has been a change in the strategic calculus in China? If so, can you give us a sense of what has changed to brought about the new convergence that you're talking of? Thank you.
Zhao, would you like to take that?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with North Korea. Actually, during the last 2 years, North Korea has been rather provocative and unpredictable in its behavior. I think in part because China hoped that the successor would be more, responsible in terms of its behavior. So China waited, and then it turned out that the successor is even more unpredictable in its behavior. Okay, and of course, in the process, China. I think there is a change in Chinese way of thinking in terms of how we perceive North Korea and its nuclear weapons program. In terms of Korea, in the old days, the reasons that we support North Korea include something like traditional friendship out of the joint fighting of the war against Americans in the 50s, and the common ideology, share a strategic buffer zone. North Korea has a strategic buffer zone, but these ideas have become outdated to a lot of increasing number of people. Okay, traditional friendship, has declined in terms of its influence. It's been a long time an interstate relationship. Traditional friendship cannot last unless you make efforts to cultivate it. And of course, ideology, we don't share the same ideology anymore. North Korea has the Juche ideology, and China has Marxism with Chinese characteristics, which is something very different. And strategic buffer zone, people increasingly realize that we are now in the age of missiles and airplanes. If anybody wants to invade China, he or she doesn't have to walk across the Korean peninsula. So it's an outdated strategic concept. And of course, increasingly people are aware of the potential damages that North Korea can inflict on China by developing nuclear weapons. I mean, it poses threats throughout the process. The experiment, the test is so close to China, and what if there is an accident, people ask. And then North Korea is economically difficult, and it's under international sanctions. If it needs money to develop the weapons program, and of course it has to sell it. Who is going to buy the nuclear technologies and weapons? Maybe what if the Uyghurs, East Turkestan independence movement, what if they got the nuclear weapons? And of course, what if the US attacked North Korea? That would create a calamity to China too. What if other countries follow North Korea's example to develop nuclear weapons in challenging the existing non-proliferation regime, which is against China's interests as well. So if you look at all these, people increasingly become aware of all these problems. I think that, to some extent, has provided the momentum of change of thinking in China.
Steinberg, did you ask for 3 triggers of?
Three factors, 3 triggers. When you talk about
Disorder.
global disorder, then what? Because there are 50 reasons or 50.
Okay, so each of you, just 3.
I can give you 2 potential triggers for major disorder. I think they're unlikely, given our historical experience and the learning process that's taken place. One, a collapse of the American will to conduct its international responsibilities. I mean, it's conceivable we could have a domestic loss of a consensus on how to proceed. We see factions in the Republican Party that were never there before about international responsibility. And there are differences long-standing in the Democratic side of the House. And that could come together in some way. But I don't think it will, because our interests don't align that way. Our interests send us back to the world and to maintain our responsibilities. The second area is on the global economic crisis. The euro crisis, in my view, is not over. The last shoe has not fallen. And we're going to see some departures from the Eurozone that are going to be very stressful and that will have knock-on effects on the Chinese export capacity, Indian export capacities, and others. But I don't think, having been through the 97 crisis, the 2008 crisis, I think we've learned how to pull together when we have to and not to engage in the kind of highly destructive policies that we saw in the 1930s, where the U.S. in the lead was shrinking markets and really striking out in directions that turned out to be very harmful. I could see it going that way, but I think it's very unlikely to do that. Jim, 3?
Well, I do think on the economic front, I think we've forgotten how close we were to a total meltdown of the global economic system at the end of 2008 and beginning of 2009. We were perilously close to and the consequences of that, it's just, you could spill it out. But it would be transformative. I certainly agree with Steve's point about the use of a nuclear weapon in a major city, either by a state or more likely a non-state actor. But I come back to, I do think that these issues around global public health and climate are the big triggers. It is very easy for me to imagine the way in which it would change the world in which we know it. People forget, we've been through SARS, we went through the bird flu. We had a situation not too long ago in Mexico, where there were instances of the bird flu, and you know, we were fortunate that the nature of the transmissibility and stuff didn't. But I mean, think about the consequences of just the U.S.-Mexican border. If the American public became convinced that there was an outbreak of a pandemic disease that was not susceptible to easy public health interventions, what it would do, and then take that to a global scale. So that's a big preoccupation, whether it's naturally occurring or deliberate through the use of biological warfare.
Aki, you have three?
I think I listed three sources of disorder, and my categories are broad enough to, I think, embrace many of the points were raised.
Okay. Thanks. Next, Dr. Lee? Oh, General Pan, you already have a microphone. Go ahead, please. And then
If I could add a few thoughts or explanations to what Qingguo has just said, that the two countries, China and the United States, are getting closer in their position towards North Korea. I think chiefly because the United States are getting a little closer to China's position, rather than China changed its position. I think China has repeatedly emphasized its traditional three-point position towards nuclear issue in the peninsula. And that is, first of all, denuclearization as a top priority. And secondly, peace and stability of this region must be maintained. And thirdly, the issue must be resolved through dialogue, peacefully. And when John Kerry visited Beijing just a couple of weeks ago, I think that the two sides got a general agreement on these principles. And Kerry quite explicitly emphasized that there is no alternative to a peaceful resolution through negotiations. Dialogue is very important. And the restraint to act in any way to feel the tension should be encouraged. And therefore, I think that after the visit, the United States actually showed some kind of restraint in showing military muscles and also offered a kind of window of opportunity for dialogue. So I get in that this is really a window of opportunity in the future when the two countries agree on these very fundamental principles for the solution of the nuclear issue. I think there is still some kind of a hope for the future, a calming down of the tension and also reactivation of a regional kind of solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ino, if you could. Yes.
It's good to hear that after all, the disorder might be more manageable than we feared. But I have a sort of question from a fairly different angle. Disorders erupt because there are causes. Is it not incumbent upon us to address the deeper lying causes? Who is going to discuss this? Is it also not upon us to discuss some ways to remove the root causes, or at least reduce the intensity of what may cause disorders?
Would anybody like to? Aki, please.
I think we need to increase people's trust and people's living conditions, and to deal with the people's aspirations. But then root causes we need to deal with. However, root causes of the plight of North Korean people, how we are going to deal with without directly dealing with the North Korean government. The root causes of extremists, terrorists, we need to deal with the development and sustainable and inclusive development in many of the countries. But then where there are ineffective governments, how the international community would deal with that's a challenge. And I think we need to do all sorts of issues to deal with root causes, but then unfortunately in international politics we need to deal also with the issues on the surface.
But I do think that international relations is a little bit like the second law of thermodynamics. I mean, you're constantly facing a system which is inclined to disorder, not to order. And so it is a question of management, of trying to figure out what the priorities are, to identify where the most urgent needs are, and where interventions can make the biggest difference. I mean, because a lot of the problems are so multidimensional and so difficult to get your hands around that it's hard to motivate people to devote resources and time to it. I mean, there's a famous saying, in policy, you look at a policy problem, when you sit around, you look at it, it's too early, it's too early, it's too early, it's too late. And so trying to figure out when is the opportunity for strategic intervention, when do you know enough about a problem to actually do something useful, is very challenging. And I think that's the real trick here, is to try to figure out where are there opportunities for intervention. We spent a lot of time looking at the question of the root causes of extremism and the like, and there just aren't really definitive answers to that. So what you can do is you can look at broad strategies like promoting global economic growth and the like, which seem to have broadly beneficial impact on lots of different things. People more successful, but even there, that's no guarantee you're going to deal with all the kinds of difficult choices we've talked about today.
Okay. Chris Nelson.
Thanks. Chris Nelson, the Nelson Report. It's so interesting that we've spent so much time in the disorder talking about how we're trying to work together on North Korea, but I think Jim just made a really important point, Dr. Steinberg, that we need to look at things we can manage. I know we've got a panel coming up later this afternoon, and maybe we should take a look at my basic question. As long as we are defining the North Korea problem as a denuclearization problem, it looks like we're really wasting our time, because they're saying they will never negotiate their nukes, the regime in power now. We're saying we will only negotiate with them about giving up their nukes. That's not going to happen. So following, in a sense, Jim's recommendation, we'll look at what we can do. Let's look at what we're really most afraid of. What is the most likely source of disorder right now with North Korea is continued perfection of the weapons they've got, continued perfection of the missile, and the proliferation risk of those. If we focus on that and not the ultimate, you give it all up, maybe that's a more manageable way to approach it. And there is a track record, starting from 1994, that shows there are ways to deal on more than the margins, on the substance of what they're producing, even if they don't give up the ultimate goal. So maybe we can, in a sense, define down the ultimate risk of disorder with these guys by finding things that really would make a substantive difference in reducing disorder, i.e. Some kind of freeze on missile and bomb development, and some kind of enforcement deal that obviously would involve China very heavily on proliferation. Thank you.
Would you like to? Anybody?
I think I certainly agree with Chris on that, and I do think, first of all, the good is not the enemy of the best. We can each take our positions on long-term denuclearization. I think, and there are a lot of greater experts than I here. I mean, I do think it's important to try to reflect on what went right and what went wrong with the Leap Day Agreement, because, I mean, that's exactly what you were talking about, and it seemed like a way forward. And I think there are many people who'd be interested in exploring whether it were possible to return to that. But I do think we have to understand, and maybe Qingguo's got some insight into that, what precisely went, I mean, obviously there's a technical question about what were the understandings on the other side, but putting that's really not the fundamental question, which is this something that actually is something that the North would be prepared to consider, and under what circumstances, and why were they apparently or appearing to be prepared to do it a year ago and not now?
Mm-hmm. With one question over there and then one here, and I think we'll probably run out of time after that one.
Francesco Mancini, International Peace Institute in New York. I was wondering the opinion of the panel on the role of the UN Security Council in this world disorder. It seems to me that countries tend to go back to the Council to address at least what we call in the panel the dry regions problems, do you think that it will be a more irrelevant forum in the future? Thank you.
Yes.
Well, definitely, I think the UN Security Council is a very important mechanism for us to address international issues. I think China fully supports the UN Security Council to play that kind of a role. With regard to the suggestion you make, I think, well, the problem is we can't secure North Korea agreement to freeze its nuclear program. If it can freeze its nuclear program, that's fine. Okay? But the problem is it will continue to test and then develop more nuclear capabilities. What are you going to do with it? I think probably we still need a sort of more consistent, more effective carrot and stick approach. If it pushes further, then probably we will increase the sanctions. Okay? If it decides to freeze the program or denuclearize or take that step toward that direction, then we can reward it with economic assistance and more security assurance. So in a way, I think states' behavior, if you don't trust that state, that's how you shape the state's behavior of that kind of situation. Yeah.
Just on the Security Council, I mean, I think I'm of the same mind as Steve, but I don't want to put words in his mouth, which is, I think there are circumstances where the Security Council may be appropriate, but I think that it's a horses for courses phenomenon, that there are different configurations for different problems, and the Security Council is not always the right one, not least of which because we haven't figured out how to undertake Security Council reform, which is really needed. I mean, it's hard to figure out how to get from here to there, but its credibility and legitimacy is affected by its composition. But there are other things. I mean, the reason, for better or for worse, that there was a successful international engagement around Libya was because it was multiple institutions that came into play: the Security Council, the Arab League, the GCC, and others. And so I think you have to think about looking at problems and figure out which problems are most, what's the right configuration of the international community to be the right set of actors to deal with them.
Very quick question to TJ, Professor Penpel.
TJ Penpel from UC Berkeley.
It's on.
There's a certain IR predisposition, I think, on the part of most of the speakers that presumes that the question that has to be dealt with in terms of managing disorder involves how states deal with one another for the most part, although I think Jim Steinberg points out that there are lots of other things going on. But one of the things I didn't hear fully addressed was the issue of the domestic politics and the possibility of very serious, I wouldn't say collapse, but a very serious change, for example, in the nature of the Chinese regime. You've got rising inequality, you've got issues of corruption, you've certainly got issues of violence and protest. Within the United States, you've certainly got rising inequality, issues of unemployment. And I guess one of the questions that I would just pose would be whether we may not also be looking at the possibility of a serious disorder that grows out of the kind of fiscal problems that are now presumed to be likely to end in a matter of months or quarters or whatever, but in fact whether we're on a trajectory where there may be serious challenges to what I guess Doug Paal called the unwillingness of the United States to continue to meet its international responsibilities. But if we get changes in the nature of the American regime and its policies, nature of China and its policies, it seems to me that would seriously affect the entire dynamic that we're talking about.
What I hear in your question is the issue of globalization and its social discontents. One of the great benefits of the end of the Cold War is that it's opened employment to people who are otherwise not a part of the modern trading system. And that's driven down wages at a certain level in a lot of countries. And it's contributed to the rusting of our Rust Belt. It's contributed to what Spain has now got 27% unemployment and 50% youth unemployment. And this is where I worry that, take these cases one by one around the world, where globalization has gotten ahead of the ability of governments to bring the standards of their workers up to where they can find jobs that keep them adequately employed and compensated. And that's where I think the problems may come. I hope we can find the mechanisms to deal with those as we go forward. But I would not underestimate the seriousness of these dislocations caused by competition for employment around the world.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to stop at that, but I must say that I'm now very pleased that we finally we started on a very high note about being able to control the disorder, but we ended on a very low note that the sources of disorder are very serious. And I really Jim's comment on how do we even define opportunities where to intervene. I think that's a very crucial question when it comes to all of the issues that we're dealing with. And as I'm sure all of us felt, this kind of forum, what we try to do is, one thing that we really focus on doing is that trying to let others find about other problems that other people are having, so that your problem isn't always the most serious problem. It seems to me that we have done a pretty good job in sharing that sense as well. So please join me in thanking the panel for the open session.